Welcome to Silmarillion chat number 10, in which we're going to cover chapter 21 of the Quenta Silmarillion of Túrin Turambar. I'll just talk through it, make some connections, offer some reflections. Though the previous chapter is called the Nerniath and Odiad, the Unnumbered Tears, and it's the officially saddest chapter in the Quenta, it's the one where everything goes wrong for everybody. And certainly politically and in bulk, it's the worst, it's the saddest. Of Túrin Turambar is very intentionally the specifically grimmest story. It's one of the three great tales of the First Age. Beren and Luthien, it's happy, full of Gondolin, sad but leads to salvation. Of Túrin Turambar, very grim. It's the most Nordic or the most Germanic that Tolkien gets. This is a point picked up in our Discord discussion actually about this with my reading group, but a big thing going on is the kind of replication and tracking of these tragic Anglo-Saxon and particularly somewhat Nordic tales, which is also exactly what Paul Anderson and in a very different vein Michael Moorcock do. And of course Anderson, argued by people like Moorcock and by others to be the kind of really serious, good high fantasy writer of the 50s. Broken Sword, which is the relevant comparator, came out in the same year as Lord of the Rings, or some of the volumes of Lord of the Rings. Broken Sword involves lots of the same elements as of Túrin Turambar. They're completely separate but parallel works, including being fostered out by elves, being caught up in an incestuous relationship, things like that. It's having magic swords. Moorcock certainly draws magic swords as well from Broken Sword, and in Túrin Turambar there is a black sword that speaks, which should make us think of Stormbringer. So you've got a kind of interesting divergence from what people expect of Tolkien. That this is not. Because what people think of Tolkien is thinking of the high fantasy stuff, is Lord of the Rings, it's a heroic quest, or even lots of the Silmarillion, which is a very different mode already, but they think, oh well, it's sad. Then again, Lord of the Rings is sad at points, but it's got this generally upbeat thing going on, and even the Nerniath and Odiad, Túrin's father, Húrin, in his great last stand before being captured by sheer weight of numbers by Morgoth, cries out, Arien Taluva, day will come again with every stroke of the axe. He knows that things are going to get better. For his family, they don't. And that's the whole thing about Túrin Turambar, is how many disasters come upon how many people due to the curse of Morgoth, and if you like, due to human sin and quasi-human sin. We'll go through. Túrin is the son of Morwen, the daughter of Baragun, so of the house of Beor, the first kindred of men, close friends with Finrod of Nargothrond, the wife of Húrin, Lord of Dor-lómin. And they have a daughter called Lalaeth, but she dies due to a plague sent from Angband. But then Túrin's 8, and Morwen is again expecting child, and this is the year of, this is after the Nerniath, but presumably, immediately after. And the Easterlings have come and are oppressing the remnants of the people of Hador, which also includes basically the remnants of the people of Beor. They enslave the children, but the Eastlings are afraid of the Lady of Dor-lómin due to her beauty and majesty. They don't attack her, they think she's magical. But she's poor, and she relies on a kinswoman of Húrin called Eirin, who's married to an Easterling. And so she thinks, because this is desperate, I'll send Túrin away to King Thingol, because King Thingol has been, Beren, son of Barahir, was her father's kinsman, Baragun's kinsman. So by dint of Thingol's love, which we've heard, he develops a real love for Beren, he'll foster Túrin. And so he does this, and he goes with 2 aged servants into the kingdom of Doriath. Thus was the fate of Túrin woven, which is foretold in the Nana Hin Húrin in the lay. There is a version of that of all of the great tales out in book form. which I haven't read. I own. That's the only one of the Great Tales I own, but I haven't read it all. I've read other sections of it in History of Middle-earth. It's also called the Tale of Grief, for it is sorrowful, and in it are revealed most evil works of Morgoth Bauglir. Túrin goes away and comes to Doriath, and Morwen has a daughter called Nienor. And Beleg, the chief of the Marchwardens of Thingol, finds them, the refugees, not Morwen, brings them to Thingol. Thingol takes them to his fostering in honour of Hurin the Steadfast, for Thingol's mood was changed toward the houses of the elf friends. Beren, and presumably also to some degree the report of things like Hur and Hurin saving the elven armies in their rearguard, that has changed Thingol's mind, and they want Morwen to come and join them. And much evil would be prevented, one suspects, if she had, but she doesn't want to leave. It's where she'd lived with Hurin, but she does send the dragon helm of Dor-Lomin, the helm of Hurin, the Lord of Dor-Lomin. And Thingol grows up for 9 years, so he's 17 by the end of this. His grief grows less, but the messengers don't come eventually, that are coming back and forth to report about his family. And Túrin is very sad. And so he goes out and he goes to battle, joining the Marchwardens of Doriath, joining the armies of the elves with his friend Beleg Cuthalion, Beleg Strongbow. On the next day, there's a thing where he doesn't get on with this a Nandor called Seros. Remember, Nandor are green elves, not grey elves, Sindar, but the Sylvan elves, who in the west, in the far west Beleriand, far west of Middle-earth, mostly live in Osiriand, but after their lord dies, many then move to Doriath. And Túrin and he are rivals, and eventually Seros dies in some sort of fight with Túrin. It's not Túrin's fault. Mabling says, don't want to come back, we'll trust Thingol to make good judgment, and this leads to Túrin fleeing. And I think there's an interesting psychological thing here that recurs again and again for me in this chapter, which is that Túrin does bring his own fate on as much as anyone else does. Not to say that he's not cursed, but the curse, here's what the curse is. The curse is that he's fatherless as he is growing up. He's fostered by a man who loves him, but who he doesn't seem to come to a point of real trust with. He doesn't think Thingol will be fair. He doesn't see his mother for all that time. He doesn't see his baby sister. He's isolated from family. There's deep trauma here. The real curse of Morgoth is not the strange weave on fate that Morgoth seems to be able to affect. He's able to, in subsidiary situations, affect fate or providence, but instead it's just the loss of his family. And he joins desperate men, and Beleg goes to find him, because Thingol says, look, I took him as my son, he will remain that, unless Hurin himself should return. I would not have any say that Túrin was driven forth. I want to welcome him back. I loved him well. Thingol, on the other hand, has really taken him in as a son. He may have lost a daughter, Luthien, in one sense, though he realised even in that he gained much. He will gain a grandson that way. But he really does take Túrin in. And yes, you have... he wants him back. So Beleg goes to find him, and he seeks far across Beleriand. Túrin, meanwhile, is with these outlaws, and in those days many desperate men are around. It's not actually orcs just sitting everywhere garrisoning everything, it's chaos. And by this point, actually, the Falas, Brithambar and Agras, the great strongholds of Círdan, have been taken, and his people have had to flee. But Nargothrond holds, Gondolin holds, and Doriath holds. And Nargothrond and Doriath are very relevant because they make the west of Middle-earth disputed and disputable. Beleg comes and he says, look, Thingol's pardoned you, whatever happened, please come back. There's orcs attacking. Túrin doesn't really want to go. He says, in the pride of his heart, Túrin refused the pardon of the king, and Beleg, his words were of no avail to change his mind. Hard you are, Túrin, and stubborn. Now the turn is mine. If you wish indeed to have the strongbow beside you, look for me in Dimbar. For thither shall I return. Because Beleg is going to go and do his duty. This is the thing. Túrin is proud. Túrin is behaving unreasonably. He's even been forgiven, and he should be able to be reconciled. But something is just askew in him. He's a great man and a great fighter, and we'll see more and more of this, but there's something wrong inside him. A comparison, actually, and a useful comparison for me, if you're thinking Middle-earth, is look at characters like Denethor. Denethor is a great man. The films, in that sense, do him dirty. I mean, it's a great performance by John Noble, but the films adapt him as maybe a very clever, wise man, but basically helpless and unreasonable and cruel. Even if he kind of wants the best, he also doesn't, and he comes too late to his senses. The point is, in the books, he's a great man, and that's precisely where a temptation comes, where he couldn't be tempted to ever join Sauron, but he could be tempted to believe in the madness that Sauron, the delusions Sauron sends via the Palantir. Thingol sighs. Beleg, Beleg tells Thingol and Melin everything that happens. He doesn't say that Thingol's companions are a bunch of thugs who attacked him. Thingol sighs. What more would Turin have me do? Give me leave, Lord, said Beleg, and I'll guard him and guide him as I may. That no man shall say that elven words are lightly spoken, nor would I wish so great a good run to nothing in the end. And Beleg is given permission to do that. He asked for a sword. He asked for a sword called Anglakel, which is the match of a sword called Angurel. These were two meteoric iron swords made by Eol, the Dark Elf, a great kinsman of Thingol and great prince in that sense of Doriath. We've heard of him before. He marries, in a slightly strange situation, Arathel, the sister of Turgon, and thereby helps sow Gondolin's doom, because Maeglin, his son, takes Angurel. These have a sort of darkness in them from Eol. He gives him, this is the first place that Lembas comes up as well. Lembas, bread, the way bread, and the viaticum. Remember, there's a symbol. It's not an allegory, but in terms of Tolkien is not actually immune from actual allegory. He just doesn't make one-to-one representations where he says this equals that. Nor, of course, did Lewis. I've spoken about that, by the way, in a video about Narnia. But the point is that Lembas is a sort of allegory because, as waybread, as viaticum, it should remind us of communion bread. For Tolkien, devout Catholic. It is wrapped in leaves of silver. The threads that bound it were sealed at the knots with the seal of the Queen, a wafer of white wax shaped as a single flower of Telperion. I think, by the way, actually, this is mentioned. Lembas might be mentioned right, chapter 3-4 of Doriath. I tell a lie before. This is great favour to Turin, for the elder never before allowed men to use this waybread, and seldom did so again. Of course, we know when they do, under Galadriel. Beleg goes to seek him. At this point, Turin falls in, and they have creates a base with Amon-Ruth, the Red Hill, which is where Mim, the petty dwarf, and his two sons live. And Mim, there's a few interesting things. Mim, the petty dwarves are those outlaws and losers who have been driven from dwarf society, have no kin, and have now died out. They've headed into the wilderness before the kindreds who found Nogrost and Belagost, and the Naugrim. So the petty dwarves are a sort of exiled, transported, criminal lot, and they've died out now until that only Mim and his sons are left, and they are still biologically dwarves, but speleologically dwarves or whatever. But the point is that and they are inferior is the word, and it's hard to know exactly how to put it. What I mean is that they already had sort of difficult tendencies, but due to their lifestyle, due to being separated from the kin, they've lost knowledge, and they've become smaller, they've become weaker than ordinary Naugrim. And actually it turns out that Túrin manages to make a friendship with Mim. It's actually an interesting thing. He says there's a really wonderful exchange. Generally one of the things that almost makes you're in the midst of this fairly moody, grim lighting of the whole story, where you're constantly being told everything's going to go wrong. You find Túrin comes to Mim and offers him aid because his son is dead. They've been killed by an arrow from one of the bandits. You can give no aid, Mim says, for this is Keem, my son. He is dead, pierced by an arrow. He died at sunset. Ibn, my son, has told me. Then pity rose in Turin's heart, and he said to Mim, alas, I would recall that shaft if I could. Now Bar and Denweth is this house shall be called in truth, and if I house of ransom. If I ever come to any wealth, I will pay you a ransom of gold for your son in token of sorrow, though it gladden your heart no more. Then Mim rose and looked long at Túrin. I hear you, he said. You speak like a dwarf lord of old, and that I marvel. Now my heart is cool, there is not glad. And in this heart you may dwell if you will, for I will pay my ransom. Túrin is a great man, like his father. He speaks like a dwarf lord of old. He understands that something disastrous has happened, and it's his fault, basically, in terms of it's his responsibility. And he wants, he understands that a dwarf would understand, in a neutral sense, good hard cash. I will give you the thing that shows my care for you, and Mim gives a sort of allegiance to him due to this. And they become friends. He listens, with him alone, he listened to his lore and the tale of his life. And we hear about the story of the petty dwarves and how they came up and how they'd delved great places, Amon Ruth and Nargothrond particularly. Beleg finds him though, and he becomes, he and Túrin resume their friendship. Mim, on the other hand, hates Beleg. There's the thing that Túrin won't go back to Doriath and Beleg won't leave him, so he falls in with the outlaws, though perhaps they can do better things. Beleg is honoured by the outlaws in general. He's strong and enduring, far-sighted in mind and in eye. But the hatred of Mim for the elf that come to Bar and Danweth grew ever greater. Why does he hate him? Well, he's jealous, I guess. Jealous of Túrin's friendship. Jealous of the way in which he suddenly kind of dominated this company. We then get an interesting bit of rhetoric. Who knows now the counsels of Morgoth? Morgoth knows more than anyone it seems pretty much in the world. And none of his enemies really understand apart from Melian, who knows now the dooms that have been woven. And so Morgoth sends an army. And at this point, Beleg and Túrin decide to take up arms in open combat against in guerrilla warfare, but in open battle against the orcs who are coming down terrorising stuff. The land becomes a relatively free land, the land of bow and helm, but Morgoth laughs because by the dragon helm, he knows that Húrin's son is there, and he knows his evil can be accomplished. And so then the bad guys kidnap Mim and Ibn and get them to betray Túrin and Beleg and this company of outlaws who has actually become a company of freedom fighters. Beleg balances a thing in Túrin that isn't right and leads the outlaws to become better men, or at least more effective for the cause of good. Mim, this is one of the most poignant things. Mim actually does get the orc captain to promise not to kill Túrin. And it's sad because this is a trick, basically, isn't it? He's going to be taken prisoner and bad things are going to happen to him when he's captured. But Mim does love, or at least honour, respect and obey Túrin. The orcs, via this betrayal, slay many of Túrin's company. Túrin's fighting but is captured. Mim comes out. He finds Beleg. Beleg manages to survive this exchange. He's sorely wounded. He tries to find Túrin to bury him, and he goes out seeking him. And he finds he doesn't find Túrin, but he finds someone, Gwyndor, son of Gwylin, who was a lord of Nargothrond, whose brother had been captured and later executed by Morgoth, and whose torture and execution was the spark of the Fingon's host attacking prematurely in the Nernaeth, which itself didn't actually lead to disaster. The crazy thing about that is it leads to the utter rout of Morgoth's forces, and Morgoth trembling on his throne as Gwyndor makes it to Angband and comes to slay his foe. But anyway, Gwyndor has escaped from Angband and is hiding out now. And Beleg finds him, and Gwyndor gives him news of a captured man, Túrin. And Gwyndor says, "Don't go on. You can't go and find him." But Beleg refuses and wants to go out, and they creep towards the dell where the prisoners are, and they free Túrin, they start freeing Túrin, cutting his chains, and then horror and tragedy strike as Túrin is woken by the sound of the black sword Anglicel. He grabs it, seizes it, and slays Beleg. And Gwyndor is trying to get him to leave, but he's heartbroken. The orcs actually flee because there is a storm from the west, which they think is from Ulmo, I guess, or whatever. They think it's from their enemies. Whatever it is, rains. So that Gwyndor and Túrin escape. But there is this Elric-like, if you like, or Paul Anderson-like black fate to come upon Túrin. He's slain his best friend, the man who balanced the weakness in him, and another dark thread of the evil fate is woven by the fact that the man who now has Túrin in hand is Gwyndor, a lord of Nargothrond. And they bury Beleg, they put Belthronding, his great bow, in it. Gwyndor takes Anglicel, and they take the Lembas as well. Thus ended Beleg's strongbow, truest of friends, greatest in skill of all that harboured in the woods of Beleriand in the elder days, at the hand of him who he most loved. An interesting repeated habit that you can find in the Saxon literature, but also elsewhere, I'll say in a moment, in the Silmarillion, is and you get it in the Lord of the Rings, the death record of these great men and women who fought for the armies of good. We've heard it I think the most obvious ones are for Fingolfin, Finrod, and Fingon, somewhat Feanor too, but particularly those three. And Beleg gets a list in the Greats. The other thing it reminds me of, and this is what it reminds me of, and I suppose Sindar is a Welsh derivative, remember, in the context of the Quenta Silmarillion, is the Welsh poem Icatraeth, which is more or less Igadothin, which is a more or less a tale of a Brythonic army going to disaster and the great deeds and deaths of all the captains and heroes of it. Because there was no happy ending, it's just sad. So what you do get is their great deeds. But Túrin, grief is graven in his face. He and Gwyndor travel. Ironically, Gwyndor is heartened by this because he's met a great man who can really fight in combat, Morgoth. He thinks he can see it. And they go and Túrin is healed at Ivrin's lake. He sings a song for Beleg, the Ler Cú Beleg, the song of the great bow. And and the sort of Anglicel seems to mourn too, so Gwyndor thinks, for Beleg. But be comforted, for I return from Nargothrond of the house of Finifin, and you shall come with me and be healed and renewed. And Túrin does ask after his father, but doesn't hear about it. Other than that, rumour comes that he still defies Morgoth, and Morgoth has laid a curse upon him and all his kin. I remember here, Hurin is seeing all this. Hurin has seen his son kill his best friend, and things are only going to get worse. They return to Nargothrond. Eventually, Orodreth welcomes them. Findulus, the daughter of Orodreth, recognises eventually Gwyndor despite his hurts. He loved him before he went away. Túrin says, "Don't say who I am." And Túrin grows high in favour with Orodreth. There is a parallel here to Huor and Hurin's friendship, and later we'll get to it, Tuor's friendship with Turgon. There's a parallel to Beren with Thingol. There's and indeed with Hurin and Huor with Fingon as well. These friendships of men which are great, and indeed bore the Easterling in his house with Maethros. They prove faithful, of course. There is this persistent pattern of elf friends who come alongside great kings. Beren and Finrod actually would be the other one, but there Finrod is actually the second in command to Beren, ironically. Now, Finduilas and Orodreth both really like Túrin. Orodreth hears the speech and bearing of the great ancient kingdom of Doriath, and even among the elves he might be taken for one from the great houses of the Noldor. Therefore many called him Adanathel, the elf man. And they reforge Anglicel to make it sharp. It becomes Gurthang, the iron of death. He becomes so famous in the guerrilla warfare Nargothrond wages to keep its plain ahead of it, to the north of it clear. And he becomes known as the Black Sword, Mormagil. And he wears dwarven armour from the armories, the dwarf mask, all gilded. And we know this is going to be relevant in this chapter, and we know it's relevant from the Nirniath, where Azagul, the king of Belagost, and his men ring Glaurung and drive him off, and then they escort Azagul from the battlefield, chanting a dirge. Finduilas begins to love Túrin. For all her previous love for Gwyndor, she now loves Túrin, and Gwyndor warns her, basically for her own good, that Morgoth has cursed Túrin, and this is going to affect Finduilas. And Finduilas just dismissed it. Túrin, son of Húrin, loves me not, nor will. Now, when Túrin learnt from Finduilas what had passed, he was wrathful, and he said to Gwyndor, "In love I hold you for rescue and safekeeping, but now you've done ill to me, my friend, to betray my right name and call my doom upon me. Gwyndor says, the doom lies in yourself, not in your name." And Orodreth honours him even more for finding this out, because he's the son of Húrin. He becomes mighty among the people of Nargothrond. This, however, leads to the next stage of the disaster, that Túrin is able to influence Orodreth to take the armies of Nargothrond to open warfare against the enemy. And much like him revealing himself by the dragon helm of Dor-Lomin, leads to Morgoth's discovery of him and Beleg at Amon Ruth, and Túrin is a devoted enemy of Morgoth. He defeats Morgoth's armies many times, but because he cannot help being bold and brave and wanting to come face to face with Morgoth, almost, if you know what I mean, he can't help but getting the doom further upon him and upon everyone he associates with. The doom of the Noldor infects so many places, and it's why Nargothrond, in a sense, is doomed anyway. But the instrument of doom is Túrin, and Túrin has this different doom, this curse, not from Mandos, but a much less just and more evil curse that's much more perverse and disgusting and makes things around it blacken. The curse to Noldor, this is separate from... There's lots of curses here. There's the curse to Noldor, which is the doom of Mandos, basically. There's the curse of Morgoth on Húrin and his house. The curse to the House of Fëanor is, as I think Manwë says, maybe it's Mandos, it's their own curse. They curse themselves with their obsession with the Silmarils. It's not anyone else, and they can never then therefore bring anything to success. But the Noldor in general, who are not in the House of Fëanor, accomplish great deeds and die nobly and enrich the world with their life despite the doom of Mandos upon them. Finrod or Fingolfin are maybe the most obvious examples, but there are others. And out of Noldor will come salvation, of course. But Túrin has this curse upon him, which is turning everything to perversion. And even though he wishes to do a good deed by fighting Morgoth and defeating his armies, it only ties Nargothrond and brings it closer to its doom. Gwyndor opposes this, but it doesn't really matter. No one's listening anymore. A thing here about Orodreth's character is he is not, Angrod and Egnor, we know, are bold men. I think it's Angrod, we know from History of Middle-earth, also has a unrequited but mutually shared romance with a wise human woman. But Orodreth and Finrod is one of the greats, one of the greats of the Noldor. Orodreth is a decent man, a good man who does well, who loves people who deserve loving, tries to do a good job, tries to fight the enemy, but he cannot live up to his brother. And the proof of it is that he cannot. First, he's unable on his own to really deal with Curufin and what's his name? what is his name? Bright, because Caranthur is dark, Curufin is crafty, and Pelargorm bright. He can't resist them basically taking over Nargothrond and beginning to plot to actually become its lords. And now he can't see that there are risks attendant on not listening to Gwyndor and letting Túrin basically become the leader of Nargothrond. If you want an argument that along with Beren, Túrin is, and Eärendil I think later, Túrin is the greatest of men that we see in the First Age. It is that this even happens, that it's even possible that a city of Noldor will come behind him and let him lead them in open war. Hope is restored, and Morwen flees at last with Nienor to come to Thingol and finds out Túrin's gone. And they stay in Doriath and are treated with honour. Now, 2 elves from Angrod's people who have been dwelling with Círdan come to Nargothrond. And they say there's a great mustering of orcs and evil creatures up at Eredwethrin in the pass of Sirion. And Ulmo has warned Círdan. And basically, actually the springs of Sirion have been poisoned. Ulmo is being driven back by his brother Valar from the north. And so they should, worse things yet to come forth. Say therefore to the Lord Nargothrond, shut the doors of the fortress and go not abroad. Orodreth was troubled, but Túrin would by no means hearken to these counsels. And here's the thing, he's built this gigantic bridge to make over the river into the guarded plain, so it's easier to send an army there. And this is something which the messengers, Gelmir and Arminas, Gelmir not the same Gelmir, who's Gwyndor's brother, which I think is the same name, isn't it? But strange coincidence. They are Noldor, of course. But they say throw down the bridge, and Túrin's like, no, we can't throw down the bridge. He was become proud and stern and would order all things as he wished. Where Curufin and Celegorm failed to functionally overthrow Orodreth, even though many followed them, Túrin now just decides Nargothrondese policy, and they want the bridge. He wants the bridge, so we can go out to fight. Now we're told that the men of Brethil are worsted, their lord is killed, and they're driven back. And Glaurung the Uraloki leads a host around Glaurung, the father of dragons, over Anfaugleith, and came thence into the northwell of Sirion, and there did great evil, and burns the guarded plain. Now Túrin leads forth the army. Tall and terrible on that day looked Túrin, alliteration, and the heart of the host was upheld as he rode in the right hand of Orodreth. But greater far was the host of Morgoth than any scouts had told, and none but Túrin, defended by his dwarf mask, could withstand the approach of Glaurung, like Azagul. The elves are driven back, and there they are penned. On that day all the pride and host of Nargothrond withered away, and Orodreth was slain in the forefront, and Gwyndor son of Gulin was wounded to the death. But Túrin came to his aid, and all fled before him, and he bore Gwyndor out there and escaped into a wood, and laid him on the grass. Let bearing pay for bearing, but ill fate was mine, says Gwyndor, and vain is thine, for my body is marred beyond healing, and I must leave Middle-earth. And though I love thee, son of Húrin, yet I rue the day I took thee from the orcs. But for thy prowess and thy pride, still I should have love and life, and Nargothrond should yet stand a while. His prowess is the problem, but also his pride. Now if thou love me, leave me, haste thee to Nargothrond and save Finduilas. And this last I say to thee, she alone stands between thee and thy doom. If thou fail her, it shall not fail to find thee. Farewell. Remember, there is regularly, Huor has had the same, many others have had the same, a death sight, a death dream, a death vision. Túrin speeds back to save Finduilas. Glaurung is there, the host is there. The bridge over the Narog proves an evil, for it's great and mightily made. They can't destroy it in time. Glaurung comes over, overthrows the doors of Felagund, and they sack Nargothrond, and they capture everyone there. And Túrin comes, and he can't be withstood. He is a battle god. He's like his father before him, and he's like Feanor. This is not necessarily those who are simply impossible to withstand. In this, there is often a doom upon. You may not, because Húrin there's no curse on personally. There's nothing wrong with him, but due to this he becomes cursed. Feanor and Túrin, there is something wrong within them and a curse upon them, and it is basically those who essentially give themselves over to violence too much, even if they are innocent of sin, if you want to call it that, in that, come to bad ends functionally. And of course that's Faramir. I love not the sword for its for its sharpness, nor the arrow for its swiftness, etc., but for that which they defend. Now Túrin meets Glaurung, and Glaurung, it turns out, has a serpentine ability. He's not just a lizard, but a serpent, almost both and, a worm. And he hypnotizes him, and he speaks vilely to him. Evil have been all thy ways, son of Húrin, thankless fosterling, outlaw, slayer of thy friend, thief of love, usurper of Nargothrond, captain foolhardy, deserter of thy kin. As thralls thy mother and thy sister live in Dor Loman in misery and want. Thou art arrayed as a prince, but they go in rags, and for thee they yearn, but thou carest not for that. Glad may thy father be to learn that he hath such a son, so learn he shall. And Túrin believes this and thinks it's true and hates himself, and he's hypnotized whilst the bad guys escape. And after Glaurung leaves, Túrin awakes. Already at this point the prisoners have gone, or rather they're being taken ahead of him, and Glaurung says, but if you want to fight, we'll fight, but then no help to your family, no heed didst thou give to the cries of the elf woman. Will thou deny also the bond of thy blood? And Túrin nonetheless stabs at Glaurung. He's not going to be tricked by that so easily. And then Glaurung says, at least thou art valiant. And they lie who say, we of our part do not honour the valor of foes. See now, offer thee freedom, go to thy kin if thou canst. And Túrin doesn't realise what a trick this is, and so accepts it and runs to go and find his family. Haste thee now, son of Húrin, to Dor Loman, or perhaps the orcs shall come before thee once again. And if thou tarry for Findulas, thou shalt never see Morwen again, and never at all shalt they see near nor thy sister, and they will curse thee. And he's obsessed. He just runs to try to get to Dor Loman to find out, and he comes to Dor Loman and finds his house empty. He finds his kinswoman, Eirin, I guess an aunt or distant cousin, and finds that Morwen was gone. And Túrin goes and asks why this has happened, why his mother's gone, and hears that the Black Sword of the South, who has now fallen, free the land from evil, and Túrin's eyes are opened. This is magic. This is very different magic. It's interesting, the elven musical hologram thing, it may deceive in one sense, but it doesn't really. The elven musical holograms are almost real and have this impact, and they're sort of, the comparison game. That's Luthien and Sauron. When Luthien wants to disguise herself, she wears the skin of a vampire. She doesn't do that kind of magic. But Glaurung only tricks. And anyway, Túrin now knows this, and he slays Brodda and the other Easterlings, and is aided by Hador's people, of whom I suppose he is now the Lord by right. His father was the Lord by right. His uncle and his father are both dead. So he's the Lord by right, but they help him. He comes south, goes to and heads towards and then decides to try to find Findulas, but just can't find her, and eventually finds in the forest of Brethil Dorlus, the leader of the fighters of Brethil. He finds him and finds Findulas slain. I think it's that Dorlus has found her slain. Tell the Mormagil that Findulas is here, and they've buried her in Howthan Eleth, the mound of the elf maid. Túrin is too late, and they bring Túrin in, and Brandir the lame, who's a gentle guy who doesn't, wants to look after his people, has a cloud of foreboding as Dorlus brings in Túrin. And Túrin recovers somewhat, and he takes a new name, Turambar, Master of Doom, and he lives with them, and he joins them in warfare. He makes the crossings of Teiglin a place of dread. Here's one thing, and I'll return to this theme. I'm saying all these things are bad, and Doom is striking everywhere, striking Nargothrond and whatever else, and that's true. The work of Morgoth, the curse of Morgoth, destroys all these people. But notice also that Morgoth is winning and bad things are happening. He's partly using Túrin as a tool for that. But a lot of damage is being done, and there are children who get to grow up. I mean, yes, Nargothrond falls quicker, but the people of Brethiel, and indeed for some time the people of Nargothrond and elsewhere, live in much more peace and are able to grow. Children grow up because of his work. It is a two-edged sword, basically. It is not that this all works to Morgoth's good, even if you might say, well, one of his great deeds was accomplished by destroying Nargothrond, which that was one of his great plans. That's true, but so much of his armies have been destroyed by Túrin and are driven back. Now, at this point, Mablung decides to go and find what's happening. Thingol finds out this stuff. Refugees from Nargothrond come to Thingol. Some say that Glaurung may still live in Nargothrond. Some say he doesn't. Some say that Mormugil was slain. Others that he was changed to stone, or as one changed to stone. But they say Mormugil was Túrin. Morwen's distraught, and she rides forth. Mablung goes to find her. Nienor also disobeys and being told to stay behind and follows Mablung. And Morwen won't be convinced. Nienor turns up, and they keep going. Mablung is essentially, he's got to help them go out and find Túrin, and he goes ahead and says, I'll go ahead and try to find out what's happening. But Glaurung knows and drives back Mablung and his company, and Glaurung comes to Morwen and Nienor, and Morwen, no one knows what happens to her after this, more or less, and Nienor is hypnotized by Glaurung. Interestingly, her will strove with him for a while, but he put forth his power. She is also great. In some ways, what's a small part for her in this, she gets a very, very cool line that she's able to resist the Great Worm, who seems to be able to just, her brother, for instance, hypnotize. Now, Mablung returns and finds Nienor, and she is basically in a daze and just doesn't know what's going on. Her strength returns, then they're attacked, and she recovers hearing and sight and flees away. And Thingol and Melin are filled with grief for this. Yet another disaster has come upon them, but Mablung goes out, and eventually, though, inevitably, with the crushing drums of doom, Nienor comes to Brethiel. This is the next part, and this is a fulfillment to Glaurung's, not his explanation really of Morgoth's curse. I don't think Glaurung is cursing him. I think Morgoth is cursing him. And of course this feeds back to the death vision of Gwyndor, that their fate's going to be intertwined in a way. I mean, when I say it's Glaurung's, the fact he says you'll never see them again if you go after Finduilas. Of course, the whole point is that there is a curse upon the house, and if he goes after Finduilas, perhaps some other path is found. Some great good comes out of it. Perhaps he becomes a Beren figure. He finds his love. Gwyndor has died. Perhaps he becomes a Tuor figure with Idril Celebrimbor. But instead he goes for his family, and so his fate is caught up with their doom. He cannot be released from it. And Túrin finds, is the one who, or Turambar finds Nienor and brings her back, and she recovers. She becomes Niniel, the Tear Maiden, at the secret base of the men of Brethiel. And then they fall in love. He teaches her, his sister, language again. Brandir, he heals her. Brandir loves her, but her heart is given to Turambar. And Brandir, for body he knew not what. Again, there is this in leaders and in great men. Brandir is a strange figure. He's a minor figure. He can't go to war, but he tries to be a decent man, and he tries to restrain Turambar. Tries to restrain Niniel, rather for her sake than his own, or rivalry with Turambar, and says to her that Turambar is Túrin, son of Húrin. And a shadow does fall upon her, but she doesn't know who that is because her memory's gone. 3 years, sometime later, they marry again after a gap, And Turambar, what happens? The orcs start attacking again, and he doesn't go forward to war because Niniel has asked him not to, apart from to defend their home itself. But eventually things keep going wrong, and Turambar does go with the black sword and defeats the orcs utterly. But Glaurung hears this, and so he's like, well, now we know where the enemy is. For the third time, Túrin's pride and prowess cause the enemy's eye to fall upon him and those who are with him. First with the outlaws, then with Nargothrond, and now with the men of Brethiel. And this will be the last time. And Glaurung is coming down, and Turambar decides to go out to fight him. And he says basically, if we don't fight him, he's going to destroy us. So I'm going to go out to fight him, and you prepare to flee. Dorlas says he'll go with him, and then Hunthor, kinsman of Brandir, goes in Brandir's stead because Brandir can't because he's lame. And Brandir is shamed by this, by Dorlas particularly. But yes, it turns out one thing is that as they arrive toward where Glaurung is, Dorlas actually loses heart, but Hunthor continues. Niniel, though, dreads the fate that is coming upon Turambar and goes forth with a great company. They love her so much they go with her. This is a crazy plan, by the way. 3 elite fighters going forward to fight a dragon is one thing. A non-warrior woman and a bunch of other people, maybe soldiers. Go forward. Brandir even goes too. He renounces his lordship, and because he's been scorned, he says, I'm going to go with Niniel too. I'll take a sword and I'll fight because you don't want me, I don't want you, but I do want to protect her. They're creeping up now on Glaurung. Hunthor, Dorlas flees. Hunthor is slain by a great stone that's dislodged on high by the movement of the dragon. And then Turambar summoned all his will and courage and climbed the cliff alone and came beneath the dragon and slays Glaurung. Acid burns Turambar, and he's badly injured. He does a hail worm of Morgoth. Well met again. Die now in the darkness have thee. Thus is Túrin, son of Húrin, avenged. He's burned and he lies in a swoon as one dead. The final vengeance of Glaurung. Here again, though, are the plans of Morgoth really coming to full fruition other than in really petty, pathetic ways? Yes, he's destroying some of his enemies, but he is losing the father of dragons to this. The good guys do not go winless in this tale. Everyone else finds them. Niniel is, as she hears Glaurung's death pang, is again hypnotised. Brandir finds her, brings her away. Turambar is dead. Come, come, he says. And Brandir takes her onwards. But then she goes mad again and flees, because she doesn't want to live without her husband, her brother Túrin. She sees the corpse of Glaurung, and then Glaurung, though his death pangs there, he somehow summons one more breath. Hail, Nienor, daughter of Húrin, we meet again ere the end. I give thee joy that thou hast found thy brother at last. Now thou shalt know him, a stabber in the dark, treacherous to foes, faithless to friends, and accursed to his kin. Túrin, son of Húrin, but the worst of all his deeds thou shalt feel in thyself. It's crazy, isn't it? The final thing, he just says things about Túrin that aren't true. Glaurung is full of lies, but this is what's poisoned these people. And then she looks down on Túrin. Farewell, O twice beloved, Túrin Turambar, Túrin Ambartanen, master of doom by doom mastered. Oh, happy to be dead. And she throws herself over the waterfall and is never seen again. Brandir, suicidal too, but he can't seek death. And he goes to bring tidings to the people. He meets Dorlas, and he says, Niniel is gone, the dragon is dead, Turambar is dead. And it says, and it turns out they were married. These married couple were brother and sister, and the people weep. This seems to be the worst. And then Túrin, coming up from his days, comes back to them. The dragon dies, and he comes. Nay, be glad, he says, for the dragon is dead, and I live. Wherefore have you scorned my counsel come into peril? Where is Niniel? For her I would see. Brandir says, Niniel is dead. But the wife of Dorlas says, he's crazed. He came here saying you are dead. He called it good tidings, but you live. Túrin is furious. Brandir says, "No, it was your sister. This is what happened. You're cursed, your kin." And Turambar falls into a fury. For in these words, he heard the feet of his doom overtaking him. Again, the musical metaphor. And he slays Brandir. He chases him and then he slays him. And he comes to the house in Eleth and pleads for Finduilas to help him. And here is the last stroke of doom upon him. Someone who's not his best friend, Beleg, but another friend, Mablung, comes upon him and hails him. He's glad, and he's come to give warning to Túrin of glowering, and Túrin says, "You're too late, the dragon is dead." And this is amazing, but he cared nothing about their praise. "Give me news, my kin, for in Dor Lomin I learned they had gone to the hidden kingdom." And Mablung is dismayed because he has to say Morwen's gone, she'll be dead. Nienor was in forgetfulness, she's escaped. And then Túrin knows that his doom's overtaken him. Brandir was telling the truth. He's unjustly killed Brandir. "A curse too upon your errand. This only was wanting. Now comes the night." This is the black and dark end of Túrin, because he knows that all his efforts have only led to the destruction of Nargothrond, the devastation of the people of Brethiel, and him slaying an innocent man, incest, the death of his sister and his mother. And he then draws his only possession remaining, Gurthang. "Hail, Gurthang, no lord or loyalty dost thou know, save the hand that wieldeth thee. From no blood wilt thou shrink. Wilt thou therefore take Túrin Turambar? Wilt thou slay me swiftly?" The blade rang a cold voice in answer. "Yea, I will drink thy blood gladly, that I may forget the blood of Beleg my master, and the blood of Brandir slain unjustly. I will slay thee swiftly." And he falls upon the sword and dies. And then Mablung takes him. "I also have been enmeshed in the doom of the children of Húrin, and thus with my tidings have slain one I loved." They burn Glaurung, and they lay Túrin in a high mound with the shards of Gurthang which are shattered, and the elves sing a lament, and a great grey stone, "Túrin Turambar Dagnir Glaurunga." I, Túrin, master of doom, slayer of Glaurung. And beneath they wrote also Nienor Niniel. But she was not there, nor was it ever known whether the cold waters of Teiglin had taken her. We come, this is the most devastatingly tragic and high and horrible thing that happens really in the Legendarium, maybe aside from the kinslaying, and the kinslayings in general, there are more to come, but that definitive moment of fall at Alqualonde. But this has spent, this is a long section. I think this is the longest chapter in the Quenta, the longest chapter I think in the whole published Silmarillion, with 29 pages, which is longer than Beren and Luthien, which is 26. And there's so much more detail you could get in. You wonder so many things. You do have these sharply drawn characters, Túrin particularly, but also Brandir and Beleg. Thingol continues to be rounded out. Thingol turns out to be one of the great, and Orodreth actually is one of the minor key, but Thingol turns out to be one of the great characters of the Quenta in all the detail you get of him. But Túrin is the overreacher, the one whose greatness is what dooms him, and the flaw within him is exploited. And again, good that he does or would do comes to doom. And this is not the normal Tolkienian story. This is much more pagan in a way, out in terms of Anglo-Saxon and Nordic influence. The one way it works out, I think, the one thing you can still see, it's very Beowulfy, of course, which is probably pagan-based story, Christianized by Anglo-Saxon monks or whoever else it might have been. But the one element you could see the normal Tolkienian hope in the midst of despair thing here, because that you see hope foiled. Maybe if Túrin goes after Finduilas, he becomes an elf friend and the father of half-elven children. But instead, what you do see is that Morgoth pays. It's a Pyrrhic victory for Morgoth, even if Morgoth doesn't realise it. He's lost so much. in pursuit of this petty aim. He has destroyed Nargothrond, that's the great aim that's accomplished via Túrin, but the cost for that, maybe it's worth it, but it's mostly he benefits from just being mean. There's nothing left in Morgoth that really benefits from accomplishing his high aims, and we don't hear anything about what he really feels about destroying Nargothrond here. We do also actually get the first example of a dragon on his hoard. That's an interesting, relevant point, mostly for Smaug, but also in general for the way we look at dragons as, given they're creatures, they're not angels, they are earthly creatures from what we can tell. They're in a funny way perhaps an equivalent not to men or elves, that's orcs, but perhaps to dwarves. They're another creature of the elements, not of earth but of fire, and they are particularly motivated by possessing beautiful things, but they don't make things and they have no practical use for them, unlike the dwarves. They're a perversion of the dwarves. I think that's probably a reasonable typology to draw. Anyway, those are my thoughts on Túrin Turambar, which is very interesting, powerful, fairly grim. Frankly, I'm looking forward to the grim but redemptive next 3 chapters next time. But if you've got thoughts on Túrin Turambar, I'd love to hear about it. Put them in the comments, and I'll see you next time.